In the darkness of a summer night in 1977, 3 little girls were stolen from their sleeping bags, brutalized, and left to die in the woods of rural Oklahoma. Their killer has never been brought to justice. This is their story. Before we go any further, I need you to do something for me right now. Hit that subscribe button. Smash the like. And drop a comment telling me what cold case has kept you up at night. Your support is what keeps these forgotten stories alive, and it helps the algorithm push this content to people who need to hear it. Let's make sure these 3 girls are never forgotten. June 13, 1977. Camp Scott, Oklahoma. A Girl Scout camp tucked away in the rolling hills and dense forests of Mayes County. For generations, this place had been a sanctuary. A place where little girls learned to tie knots, sing songs around campfires, make friendships that would last a lifetime. Parents sent their daughters here believing they were sending them somewhere safe. Somewhere protected. Somewhere wholesome. But that summer, Camp Scott would become something else entirely. It would become a crime scene. A place of unspeakable horror. A name that would forever be associated with tragedy, terror, and 3 young lives cut impossibly short. Let me tell you about those 3 girls. Lori Lee Farmer. 8 years old. A bright-eyed child with a smile that could light up a room. She was excited about camp. She'd packed her bags carefully, making sure she had everything she needed. Her parents hugged her goodbye, never imagining that hug would be their last. Michelle Heather Guse. 9 years old. Full of energy and life. She loved the outdoors. She loved adventure. Camp Scott was supposed to be the perfect place for her. Her family sent her off with love and encouragement, believing she was about to have the time of her life. Doris Denise Milner. 10 years old. The oldest of the 3. Responsible. Kind. Looking forward to making new friends and experiencing everything camp had to offer. Her parents trusted Camp Scott. They trusted the counselors. They trusted that their daughter would be watched over and kept safe. 3 different girls. 3 different families. 3 separate lives that would become forever intertwined in the most tragic way imaginable. The girls arrived at Camp Scott on Sunday, June 12. It was the first day of camp. Excitement was in the air. Hundreds of girls had descended on the camp, all eager to begin their adventure. Lori, Michelle, and Doris were assigned to tent number 8 in the Kiowa unit, one of several camping areas spread across the property. The Kiowa unit was isolated, set back from the main camp, surrounded by thick woods and accessible only by a narrow dirt path. It was remote. It was quiet. And as it would turn out, it was dangerously vulnerable. That first night, the girls settled into their tent. They talked and giggled the way young girls do. They were nervous and excited all at once. Around them, other campers were doing the same, settling in, making friends, adjusting to sleeping outdoors. The counselors made their rounds, checking on the girls, making sure everyone was comfortable. Everything seemed normal. Everything seemed safe. But it wasn't. Sometime in the early morning hours of June 13, while the girls slept, someone entered tent number 8. Someone with evil intentions. Someone who had been watching. Someone who had been waiting. What happened next is almost too horrific to put into words. The girls were attacked in their sleep. They were beaten with brutal force. Their small bodies were no match for the violence inflicted upon them. Evidence would later reveal that they were sexually assaulted. Violated in ways no child should ever experience. And then they were taken. Dragged from the tent. Carried through the woods. And left in a clearing, discarded like they meant nothing. When morning came, the camp began to stir. Counselors started waking campers for breakfast. But something was wrong. Tent number 8 was quiet. Too quiet. When a counselor went to check on the girls, the tent was empty. Sleeping bags were disheveled. Personal belongings were scattered. Panic set in immediately. A search began. Counselors and camp staff spread out across the property, calling the girls' names, checking every tent, every building, every trail. And then, just after 6 o'clock in the morning, a counselor walking along a path near the camp made a discovery that would change everything. She found them. Lori, Michelle, and Doris. All 3 girls. Dead. Their bodies were lying in the woods, partially covered, left in the open. The counselor screamed. Other staff came running. What they saw was a scene of unimaginable horror. 3 young girls, brutalized and discarded. Their lives stolen in the cruelest way possible. Law enforcement was called immediately. The Mays County Sheriff's Department arrived, followed by the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation. Crime scene investigators descended on Camp Scott. What they found painted a picture of calculated violence. The tent where the girls had been sleeping showed signs of a struggle. Blood was found inside. A flashlight that didn't belong to the campers was discovered nearby. Outside the tent, there were drag marks leading into the woods, evidence that the girls had been pulled from the tent and taken to the location where their bodies were found. Investigators also found a cave not far from the camp. Inside, they discovered items that appeared to belong to the suspect. Photographs of women and girls. A newspaper clipping about the camp. A roll of duct tape. Boot prints. Cigarette butts. It appeared someone had been using the cave as a hideout, possibly watching the camp, planning this attack. The autopsies confirmed what investigators feared. All 3 girls had been sexually assaulted. All 3 had suffered blunt force trauma to the head. The medical examiner determined that they had likely been killed in the early morning hours, sometime between 2 and 5 a.m. The cause of death for all 3 was determined to be a combination of blunt force trauma and asphyxiation. The news spread quickly. Parents who had sent their daughters to Camp Scott were contacted and told to pick them up immediately. The camp was shut down. Families across Oklahoma were horrified. The idea that something so evil could happen at a place meant to be safe and nurturing was almost incomprehensible. This wasn't supposed to happen here. Not at a Girl Scout camp. Not to innocent children. The investigation moved quickly. Investigators had a suspect in mind almost immediately. His name was Gene Leroy Hart. A 33-year-old Cherokee man with a violent criminal history. Hart had been convicted of kidnapping and assault in the past and had escaped from prison just a few years earlier. He'd been on the run ever since, hiding in the forests and back roads of eastern Oklahoma. Investigators believed he'd been living in the woods near Camp Scott, possibly even in that cave where evidence was found. Hart's criminal past made him an obvious suspect. In 1966, he had been convicted of kidnapping and raping 2 pregnant women. He'd held them at gunpoint, assaulted them, and left them traumatized. He was sentenced to prison, but in 1973, he escaped. For 4 years, he had evaded capture, moving through the Cherokee Nation, relying on friends and family to help him stay hidden. Law enforcement believed Hart was their man. They pointed to several pieces of evidence. The boot prints found at the cave matched boots that Hart was known to wear. The duct tape found in the cave was similar to tape that had been used in the attack. Eyewitnesses reported seeing a man matching Hart's description near the camp in the days leading up to the murders. And perhaps most damning, investigators found a fingerprint on the flashlight discovered near tent number 8. They claimed it belonged to Gene Leroy Hart. But there was a problem. Within the Cherokee community, many people didn't believe Hart was guilty. They believed he was being targeted because of his race, because he was Native American, because he was an easy scapegoat for a crime that law enforcement desperately wanted to solve. They pointed out that Hart had never harmed children before. His previous crimes, as horrific as they were, involved adult women. There was no history of violence against children. No history of murder. Hart's supporters also questioned the evidence. The fingerprint, they argued, was not a definitive match. The boot prints could have belonged to anyone. The duct tape was a common brand. The eyewitness accounts were unreliable. They believed that law enforcement was rushing to judgment, desperate to close a case that had captured national attention and terrified an entire state. The manhunt for Jean Leroy Hart became one of the largest in Oklahoma history. Hundreds of law enforcement officers combed the forests of eastern Oklahoma. Helicopters circled overhead. Bloodhounds tracked his scent. Roadblocks were set up. Tips poured in from across the state. But Hart remained elusive. He knew the land. He had help. And he stayed one step ahead. Finally, in April of 1978, nearly 10 months after the murders, Jean Leroy Hart was captured. He was found hiding in a small house in the Cherokee Nation, surrounded by supporters who believed in his innocence. He was arrested without incident and taken into custody. The trial began in March of 1979. It was held in Mayes County, and the entire state was watching. The prosecution presented their case, laying out the evidence they believed proved Hart's guilt. They presented the boot prints, the duct tape, the fingerprint, the eyewitness testimony. They argued that Hart had been living in the woods near Camp Scott, that he had been watching the camp, and that he had planned and executed the murders of Lori Farmer, Michelle Guse, and Doris Milner. The defense fought back hard. They brought in their own experts who challenged the fingerprint analysis. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial at best. They pointed out that there was no physical evidence directly linking Hart to the crime scene. No DNA. No murder weapon. No definitive proof. They painted a picture of a man who was being railroaded because of his past, because of his race, because law enforcement needed someone to blame. The jury deliberated for several hours. When they returned, the courtroom was silent. The verdict was read. Not guilty. Jean Leroy Hart was acquitted. The families of Lori, Michelle, and Doris were devastated. They couldn't believe it. They had been told that this was the man who had killed their daughters. They had been told that justice would be served. And now, the man they believed was responsible was walking free. For the prosecution, it was a crushing defeat. For Hart's supporters, it was vindication. But for the families, it was neither. It was just emptiness. An unresolved ending. No closure. No justice. Just unanswered questions and sleepless nights. If you're still watching at this point, drop a comment with "I'm still here." Let's see who's truly following this shocking story. Jean Leroy Hart didn't walk free for long. Just 2 months after his acquittal, in June of 1979, he died of a heart attack while exercising in prison. He had been reincarcerated for his previous escape conviction. His death meant that he would never face another trial. He would never be questioned again. And for the families, it meant that even if he was guilty, they would never get the satisfaction of seeing him convicted. But the story doesn't end there. For decades, the case remained officially unsolved. The Mayes County Sheriff's Department never stopped investigating. Tips continued to come in. New leads were followed. But nothing ever led to another arrest. Then, in 2008, nearly 30 years after the murders, advances in DNA technology offered new hope. Investigators decided to retest evidence from the crime scene using modern forensic techniques that hadn't existed in 1977. Hair samples. Biological evidence. Anything that might yield DNA. The results came back in 2008. According to the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, the DNA evidence pointed to Jean Leroy Hart. Authorities announced that based on this new analysis, they were officially closing the case. As far as they were concerned, Hart was the killer. But even this didn't bring closure. Some forensic experts questioned the DNA results, pointing out limitations in the testing methods used. Hart's family and supporters continued to maintain his innocence. And the families of the victims were left with mixed feelings. Some felt vindicated. Others felt that the announcement was just an attempt to close a case that had haunted law enforcement for decades, regardless of whether it was truly solved. What's undeniable is this: 3 little girls went to summer camp and never came home. Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Heather Guse, Doris Denise Milner. Their lives were stolen in the most brutal way imaginable. Their families were left to grieve, to search for answers, to live with a pain that never goes away. Camp Scott never reopened. The property was sold, and the buildings were eventually torn down. The land where those 3 girls took their last breaths is now overgrown, reclaimed by the forest. But the memory of what happened there remains. For the parents of Lori, Michelle, and Doris, life after that summer was never the same. They became advocates for victims' rights. They pushed for better safety measures at camps and youth organizations. They tried to turn their unimaginable grief into something that might protect other children. But nothing could bring their daughters back. In the years since, journalists, documentary filmmakers, and true crime enthusiasts have revisited the case again and again. Books have been written. Television specials have been produced. Podcasts have dedicated entire series to examining every detail, every piece of evidence, every theory. The case has become one of the most well-known unsolved mysteries in American true crime history. And yet, for all the attention, for all the investigation, for all the advances in technology, there are still questions. Was Jean Leroy Hart really the killer? Or was he a convenient suspect, targeted because of his past and his race? Were there other suspects that were never properly investigated? Could there have been more than one attacker? Why were these 3 specific girls targeted? Was it random, or was there something that made them vulnerable that night? The truth is, we may never know for certain. What we do know is that on the night of June 12, 1977, 3 innocent children went to sleep in a tent in the woods of Oklahoma, and they never woke up. Someone took their lives. Someone brutalized them. Someone destroyed 3 families and shattered the sense of safety that an entire generation had felt. This case reminds us of a harsh reality. Evil exists. It can strike anywhere, even in places we consider safe. Even in places designed to protect and nurture our children. And sometimes, no matter how hard we search, no matter how much we want justice, the answers remain just out of reach. Lori, Michelle, and Doris deserved better. They deserved to grow up. They deserved to experience all the joys and milestones of life. First crushes. High school graduations. Weddings. Children of their own. All of that was taken from them in one horrific night. Their families deserved better too. They deserved to see justice served. They deserved to have their questions answered. They deserved to know, beyond any doubt, who was responsible and why it happened. Instead, they were left with speculation. With theories. With a legal system that, in their eyes, failed them. With a verdict that felt like a betrayal. And with DNA results that came decades too late to matter in a courtroom. The legacy of the Camp Scott murders is complicated. It's a story of tragedy and loss. It's a story of a community torn apart by suspicion and racial tension. It's a story of a justice system that sometimes falls short. And it's a story that has never truly ended, because for the families of those 3 girls, there is no ending. There is only the ongoing weight of grief and unanswered questions. As I researched this case, as I read through the trial transcripts, as I looked at the photographs of Lori, Michelle, and Doris smiling in their school pictures, I kept coming back to one thought. These were children. Innocent, trusting, excited children who were failed by the very institutions that were supposed to protect them. They were failed by a camp that didn't have adequate security. They were failed by a justice system that couldn't definitively solve their murders. They were failed by a society that allowed a violent predator, whether it was Hart or someone else, to be in a position to harm them. And beyond the failures, beyond the investigation, beyond the trial and the DNA and the theories, what remains is the simplest, most heartbreaking truth of all. 3 little girls are gone. 3 families are forever broken. 3 lives full of potential and promise were snuffed out before they even really began. We tell these stories, we revisit these cases, not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remember. To honor the victims. To refuse to let them be forgotten. Lori Lee Farmer, Michelle Heather Guse, and Doris Denise Milner were real people. They had dreams and fears and favorite foods and best friends. They were loved. They are still loved. And they deserve to be remembered for who they were, not just for how they died. The woods of eastern Oklahoma still stand. The forests where those girls took their last breaths are still there, quiet and green. If you visit the area today, you won't find much evidence that Camp Scott ever existed. But if you know the history, if you know the story, you can almost feel the weight of what happened there. The sadness. The loss. The lingering question of why. This case has been officially closed by law enforcement. They say they have their answer. But for many people, the question remains open. And perhaps that's the most haunting aspect of all. Not knowing for certain. Living with doubt. Wondering if justice was truly served or if the real killer got away. What I can tell you is this. Whether Jean Leroy Hart was guilty or innocent, whether the DNA evidence is reliable or flawed, whether there were other suspects or not, none of it changes the fundamental tragedy at the heart of this story. 3 children died violently and senselessly. 3 families lost their daughters. And an entire community lost its innocence. The camp murders of 1977 remind us that monsters are real. They remind us that we must be vigilant in protecting our children. They remind us that justice is not always swift, not always certain, and not always satisfying. And they remind us that some wounds never fully heal. For 47 years now, the families of Lori, Michelle, and Doris have carried the weight of this tragedy. They've had birthdays without their daughters. Holidays without them. Graduations and weddings and grandchildren that will never be. They've had to watch as the case was debated and dissected by strangers. They've had to live with the knowledge that someone out there knows the full truth of what happened that night, and that truth may have died with them. If there's a lesson in this heartbreaking story, it's that we must do better. We must protect our children with everything we have. We must demand justice for victims, even when it's difficult, even when it takes decades. We must not allow cases to go cold simply because they're hard to solve. And we must never, ever forget the names and faces of those who were taken from us. Lori Lee Farmer. 8 years old. A little girl who loved her family and was excited about summer camp. Michelle Heather Guse. 9 years old. A child full of energy and curiosity. Doris Denise Milner. 10 years old. A responsible, kind girl who was looking forward to making new friends. Say their names. Remember them. Honor them. This is their story. This is the tragedy of Camp Scott. And this is a reminder that some cases, no matter how much time passes, will always haunt us. Before you go, I need you to do one final thing. If this story moved you, if you believe these 3 girls deserve to be remembered, subscribe to Cold Case Crime Lab right now. Hit that like button. And leave a comment below with the hashtag Justice for Camp Scott. Share this video. Let's make sure that Lori, Michelle, and Doris are never forgotten. Let's keep their memory alive. Because that's the one thing we can still do for them. We can remember. We can tell their story. And we can make sure that the world knows their names. Thank you for watching. This is Cold Case Crime Lab, where the cases may be cold, but the search for truth never stops.